MENA Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
I'd like to welcome Gerald Karner to this MENA Watch podcast. Allow me to briefly introduce you. You are a former Brigadier of the Austrian Armed Forces, now a highly sought-after expert on global and military issues, and also a very successful book author. Mr. Karner, today I'd like to talk with you about the war in Iran. My first question, how surprised were you by the coordinated attack from the USA and Israel, which took place 4 days ago?
Good day, dear Mr. Kaltenbrunner. I'm pleased to be a guest once again, even though it's a very difficult and rather sad topic to discuss. I was not genuinely taken aback. One couldn't possibly be surprised by this significant assault by the United States and Israel against Iran, especially considering the extensive military deployment that had already occurred in the vicinity of Iran. We are well aware that this represents the largest deployment of Western forces, and that's not even including Israel yet, since 2003, specifically since the war the US and a US-led coalition conducted against Iraq. And as a former military person, it was quite evident to me that the likelihood of this force staying there for an extended period or even being completely pulled back and departing the region without achieving its objectives was rather slim. However, it is of course clear that this was a political decision, and it demands a political decision because purely theoretically that too would have been possible. But as I've mentioned, I consider it highly improbable, and those negotiations that were conducted in Geneva, well, I honestly didn't really perceive them as having much of a chance for success anymore. Why? Simply because the demands made by the USA, and naturally Israel supporting them in the background, were so stringent that it became exceedingly difficult for Iran, particularly for its current leadership, to compromise or meet any of those demands. This situation is perhaps less about their nuclear program and more focused on the continued development of ballistic missiles, those potential delivery systems for nuclear weapons, which Iran was unwilling to concede. Therefore, it wasn't truly surprising.
Perhaps you could give us some perspective on how large this buildup was. So, how exactly can we envision this? I mean, what kind of material have the Americans stationed in the Persian Gulf and the Mediterranean, and partly at their bases within the Gulf states? And on the other hand, how prepared is Israel for this war?
Yes, what the US deployed here was truly enormous. Experts state that this constitutes 40% of the total available capacity for such deployments of the US armed forces that were mobilized in that region. We also mustn't overlook that there are still substantial US forces, for example, stationed in the Caribbean. Also, forward deployments exist in Japan and South Korea, which are maintained at full division strength. So, one mustn't overlook that. Enormous resources have been brought to bear here. There are still no official figures regarding the number of personnel deployed there by the United States. However, if you just consider the 2 aircraft carriers currently in the region, namely the USS Gerald Ford in the eastern Mediterranean and the USS Abraham Lincoln in the Indian Ocean, each has 5,000 personnel stationed aboard. That alone accounts for 10,000 people on just those 2 ships. And each of these 2 colossal aircraft carriers carries not only about 80 to 100 combat aircraft, but is also escorted by multiple other U.S. Navy vessels, such as destroyers, cruisers, or submarines, and naturally, their accompanying supply ships, ensuring full operational capability and readiness for any mission. And then, of course, you also have the U.S. forces already stationed in the region across the various military bases located there, which includes, naturally, locations from Iraq, all the way through Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, and even Abu Dhabi in the Emirates. And these were also significantly reinforced in recent weeks. In recent weeks, we have also been able to observe numerous transport aircraft that, for example, flew in over Great Britain and subsequently entered this region or also flew over Germany. Incidentally, it's also quite interesting that these allies are naturally making their territories and military bases readily available to support a military action by the United States of America. So, in a way, Donald Trump perhaps does need his allies in Europe for such operations, for the sake of the USA's interests. So, a massive military force. We're certainly talking about tens of thousands of soldiers deployed here, probably around 100,000, but it's not possible to give an exact figure at the moment.
If you could perhaps outline the very first day of the attack, what precisely were the targets then?
It was, of course, very interesting, and its success is largely dependent, obviously, on intelligence assessments. Well, usually such operations typically commence during the late evening or the pre-dawn hours, certainly while darkness still prevails. Just consider the Iraq War, for instance. However, this particular time around it was quite different. Apparently they were waiting for an opportune moment on Saturday, which in Iran is actually Monday, the start of the work week. I'd argue that with a clear disregard for professional security protocols, a considerably large gathering of Iran's political and military leadership, comprised of many senior figures, found themselves in a single location. Compound were gathered for a conference with the supreme spiritual leader, Khamenei, also present. This opportunity was, so to speak, taken advantage of to initiate and execute a devastating attack against this group. Khamenei was killed, fell victim, along with the defense minister, the chief of the general staff, and the commander of the Revolutionary Guards, just to name the most important representatives. So, a massive first strike that undoubtedly shocked the Iranian regime, that's crystal clear. In all likelihood, this was only made possible because individuals were indeed placed or even infiltrated into the close proximity of Khamenei. These individuals meticulously observed his habits and movements, subsequently enabling them to relay vital information to Western intelligence agencies, it seems.
But as you've already said, how can it be that an almost complete leadership team of a country military, and in this case also spiritual, plus presidential and military advisors gather for one meeting? Is that not unusual?
It is very unusual, especially for Iran. For states of lesser importance, something like that is still quite common. For example, having several important representatives travel on the same plane. That just happens. But for it to happen to Iran under this specific threat, a threat they surely knew about since they could observe the military build-up, and of course they had heard the announcements very clearly, especially from Donald Trump himself, detailing what would happen if Iran didn't relent, so that truly is quite surprising indeed. But my personal explanation is simply this, that in a regime like Iran, the will of the prevailing political leadership is simply supreme, meaning such a law dictates that the military command has absolutely no alternative but to execute this will, and a warning against it probably also means falling out of favor and incurring the displeasure of the supreme spiritual leader of the country. As utterly ridiculous as that may sound, I'm afraid that this kind of blind obedience is a crucial element of such autocratic or even theocratic regimes.
How would you rate the role of the Israeli and American intelligence services? This isn't an operation you just do overnight. This probably took years of preparation. How does something like this even happen? How is it possible that direct advisors or even staff members of the president were able to infiltrate all the way up to the very highest echelons of power?
Yes, absolutely correct. It is quite astonishing. So, typically, individuals of this nature, human sources, who hold such prominent positions there, meaning they must undoubtedly be considered part of the staff, indeed key personnel within the organization, they are cultivated for years, for many years, and then subsequently placed in position. And that in itself is indeed quite an art form, especially considering the crucial need to preserve that source afterwards. This means not allowing them to be exposed. So that source must have been very professionally trained and prepared, and the intelligence agency that carried this out also performed its duties very professionally. The Mossad has already proven this many times, not least just last year, that they are indeed capable of such broad-scale operations in a very comprehensive manner. Mossad also possesses extensive experience in this field. Reportedly, the CIA was actually supposed to have been the one in a leadership capacity this time. That's something one would probably only find out in hindsight, if at all possible. But in any case, the cooperation between these two services obviously works very well and very professionally. As I said, years of preparation ready for any eventuality whatsoever. And when one is certain of their cause and the political button is pressed, when that political decision is made that this particular source is available, and then precisely delivers the necessary information with such accuracy, specifically temporal and spatial precision, that is simply a professionally high-quality accomplishment.
Now, there are reports that Mossad, for example, has been controlling all the traffic cameras in Tehran and has had access to this footage for years. How technologically equipped do you have to be? How big of a role does AI play now? Is it just more high-tech that's being used?
Well, it's absolutely high-tech, and it's certainly true that, for instance, access can be gained to the cameras. An intelligence service handles this much better than private individuals, though they can do it. Just think about the evidence regarding the downing of the Dutch, or rather the Malaysian commercial airliner by Russia, over Ukrainian, specifically over eastern Ukrainian territory. It was there that Bellingcat, the platform, managed to prove, also by accessing traffic cameras, that a Russian anti-aircraft system, missile system crossed into Ukrainian territory, and from that very spot it shot down that passenger jet. So even private groups can do it, but intelligence agencies can, of course, do it much better. And when you mention AI, yes, regarding the merging of such information, which truly encompasses an incredible variety of data, if you're talking about traffic cameras, we're naturally also discussing other sources, both technical and, of course, human in nature. It wouldn't have been just a single person on site who was infiltrated into the area. Rather, there would certainly have been multiple individuals who, in all likelihood, maintained contact among themselves. Overall, high technology is, of course, absolutely utilized here, and not least, the relevant institute at Tel Aviv University enjoys an exceptionally strong reputation for this very reason. This is, so to speak, truly state-of-the-art. In terms of intelligence, they are arguably among the most professional agencies in the entire world. I'm referring to Mossad, the CIA, and also the NSA, perhaps alongside Great Britain's MI6.
Aside from the intelligence work, what are the American and Israeli armies focusing on now? What targets do they primarily want to destroy in Iran? Follow-up question. Iran is vast. It has many underground bunkers. It's very spread out. Can all these targets, threats, and dangers regarding missiles and so on truly be effectively targeted from the air, or will it solely require ground combat operations?
Indeed, most of it, especially the most dangerous facilities and weapon systems, can certainly be eliminated and successfully combated, but that simply takes time. You mentioned the immense territory of Iran, and of course we are also talking about a very peculiar topography with some extremely high mountains and mountain ranges. So naturally, over time, Iran can certainly do a great deal to effectively conceal its own capabilities, such as weapon systems, ammunition storage facilities, and similar assets. But at some point, they naturally have to emerge from their fortified underground bunkers to be able to unleash their weaponry. And that's where precise localization becomes crucial, for instance, through satellite systems, which both Israel and the US undoubtedly possess, and then the quick guidance of their own weapon systems to the target with maximum speed. Thus, the immediate priority, the very first step, is undeniably to combat with standoff weapons all that might subsequently endanger, for instance, American military installations, and above all, the sovereign territory of Israel, potentially launching attacks. These are, of course, longer-range ballistic missiles, they are cruise missiles, they are also drones. Simultaneously, anti-aircraft systems must be neutralized. These systems could then either manage or directly engage their own, meaning American or Israeli, aircraft operating within Iranian airspace. Once that is accomplished, these allied forces will have de facto air superiority and can then begin, very systematically and progressively, as mentioned earlier, to thoroughly decimate the entirety of the Iranian armed forces, leaving them significantly weakened. And, as I mentioned, such a situation certainly can happen, but it does take its natural course of time to unfold.
What we've seen these last few days is Iran fighting tooth and nail. attacking not only Israel but also military bases in the Gulf like the United. Arab Emirates, all the way to Saudi Arabia with drones. I believe the American embassy was attacked today with an Iranian drone. How strong is Iran militarily? How strong should we consider it?
Yes, we can see that Iran has obviously used the last few months since the attacks by Israel and the US in June of last year very consistently to, on the one hand, replenish its stocks, some of which were used up then, and also partly to renew, modernize, and protect them. And those are likely the reasons why Iran is obviously succeeding in penetrating and breaking through this certainly very dense air defense shield, both over the American bases in the neighboring states of the Persian Gulf and also, unfortunately, in Israel. However, it must be acknowledged that the majority of these offensive weapons are intercepted and repelled. Nevertheless, a few inevitably break through, and Israel has, unfortunately, had the disturbing experience of discovering that Iran seemingly possesses multiple warheads, which are guided. Ballistic guided missiles, which can then be steered to different targets during their final approach. So these are very advanced and highly sophisticated technologies. I'll just claim now, without having real proof, but there is enough circumstantial evidence. Russia probably lent a hand here with the development in Iran in exchange for Iran's delivery of Shahed drones to Russia. So this certainly has its underlying reasons. That is also Iranian or Russian high-tech, depending on how you look at it. And something like that is naturally quite difficult to defend against, as you don't know exactly when, so to speak, the final stage is released, and warheads are on their terminal approach, or rather, you can't really engage it earlier, so to speak, but must wait until that moment actually happens. And once that crucial moment comes to pass, the conditions for a successful defense against these multiple warheads essentially multiply, leading to the undeniable fact that one or two of them will indeed manage to get through the defenses.
What is Iran's strategy in also attacking Gulf states? Do they want to ignite a widespread conflagration? Do they wish for these nations to be drawn into the conflict to join in? What Iran is doing there is in principle a bit like kamikaze.
Well, that question is, of course, more than justified. In reality, if it truly was the strategy to persuade these Arab states, more or less, to put pressure on the USA to stop this operation, it quite evidently did not succeed. On the contrary, Iran has now actually managed to turn these states against itself quite effectively. We hear there are already threats, especially from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, as you're aware, is not only Iran's strongest rival in the region, but is also heavily armed to the teeth, fully equipped, and constantly issuing threats of retaliation against Iran. So Iran certainly hasn't achieved that objective. In some respects, it's undoubtedly a form of lashing out from a battered regime, not always to be viewed through a rational lens, but naturally the crucial aspect now is to ensure the survival of the regime itself, and especially to safeguard the Revolutionary Guards, who are the guarantors for the existence of the current political leadership of Iran. Because they are, essentially the guarantors, more or less, for the continued existence of the current political leadership in Iran. And in any case, as I was saying, I really do believe that this particular strategy hasn't proven to be very successful so far. Would you agree? On the contrary, Iran is becoming more and more isolated because of it. I believe we also shouldn't overlook that fact, because in recent years this operation has not really been favorable to many who were counting on negotiations, and that was one of the reasons why. In recent years, it indeed succeeded, more or less, in fostering a kind of discreet, mutually negotiated understanding between Iran and the other Persian Gulf states. However, this was inherently fragile, given the Iranian regime's undeniable unpredictability, not to mention its theocratic and absolutist nature, which instills great fear. Absolutist reign of terror, but it was generally believed that they had reached a point where mutual trust could truly take hold, stabilize, and perhaps even solidify between them. Well, that's now definitely over, and it's also truly Iran's fault that it's over. It might have been better, although I'm certainly not in a position to give anyone good advice regarding this, to focus on the American bases rather than more or less indiscriminately attacking civilian facilities in the Gulf states. I'm referring to Dubai, for example. For example,
how long do you estimate it would take for Iran to? Or perhaps let me rephrase that question. You mentioned earlier that after the 12-day conflict with Israel and the US, Iran managed to resupply or replenish its weapons. Is that correct? Where do these weapons come from? How is it possible to refill the arsenals within a few months? Are there suppliers? Is it China? Is it Russia? Who is supplying Iran? I don't believe they could have ramped up their own production enough to do that in just a few months. Or, to put it another way, did the Americans and Israelis somewhat exaggerate things by claiming they had already destroyed everything and that Iran would no longer pose a threat? However, it has now been proven that this is not the case at all.
Yes, the exaggeration certainly came from Donald Trump himself, who claimed that the entire Iranian nuclear program was destroyed. So that was most certainly not really the case at all. This was grossly exaggerated, and exaggerations almost always backfire in politics, especially in security and defense. And it's pretty clear that the same holds true for all the other weapon systems that Iran had at its disposal at that time and apparently still continues to possess even now. When we talk about the provenance of these weapon systems, we are simply talking about Russia. Russia was, yes, a strategic partner, or rather, has always been a strategic partner of Iran. They supplied each other with technology, but also with weapon systems. Furthermore, a rather intriguing aspect from my perspective is emerging. Much like in Russia's ongoing conflict against Ukraine, it's now evident that these Russian defense systems, particularly the formidable heavy anti-aircraft weaponry and their integrated radar components, are simply incapable of neutralizing the more sophisticated and intricate incoming guided missiles and intercept them. Western technology simply seems to be considerably superior to Russian technology, as has been proven time and again in Ukraine, if we disregard the simple drone swarms for a moment. And that, of course, presents a significant long-term problem for Russia, given that its only truly notable and high-quality industrial output primarily comes from its defense and armaments sector, which is practically its entire industry. And if Russia can no longer find markets for its weapons, then things will become even more uncomfortably burdensome for the country, because then, for instance, both India and Pakistan will undoubtedly seek their arms from other sources and no longer from Russia. China, of course, is already knocking at the door, and it's quite probable that China will indeed be able to offer weapon systems of much higher quality than Russia, and most likely will do so as a replacement.
Now, Israel and the US have conflicting reports on how long this war can or must last. Trump said the ammunition won't run out, they will finish the job. He expects 4 to 5 weeks. The Israelis say it will be over much sooner. What is your estimation then of how long it will take for Iran, its government, or its military to be sufficiently weakened so that we can genuinely speak of a successful outcome?
Well, the question of success is, of course, also a question of objectives. And we are well aware that even here within the USA itself, there are extremely heated and deeply controversial discussions unfolding regarding the very objectives of this war. Well, an initial superficial objective could, of course, be to render Iran more or less defenseless. This means decimating Iran's armed forces, and particularly its Revolutionary Guards, to the extent that they can no longer function as a cohesive, structured organization. In my professional opinion, achieving that could certainly happen quite a bit earlier than a time frame of 4 to 5 weeks. We are already observing that Iran is actually deploying its highest quality systems, such as the previously mentioned ballistic missiles equipped with multiple warheads. I don't think it will have too many of those, so it could indeed be the case. Somewhere between 10 days and 4 weeks, it could very well be the situation where one can confidently state, yes, the Revolutionary Guards, though still in existence in a rudimentary form, possess scarcely any significant weapon systems that pose a threat to the alliance. So that's one thing, it would be a superficial objective, so to speak. The question of further objectives is then, naturally, how far one wishes to proceed in combating those installations, and indeed all facilities generally, such as bunkers and other similar sites, that are involved in the enrichment of uranium. Do you want to, so to speak, now bring to a close what was begun in June of last year? And how exactly do you even verify that anyway? Because the normal routine procedure for such airstrikes is to conduct a thorough damage assessment, if you have the means, using satellites or possibly photographs to carefully record all the damages and then strategically decide, does this target need to be hit again, or is this target eliminated so we can move on to a new one? With bunkers, that's obviously quite difficult, especially when they're located in mountainous regions, which appears to be the situation in the Natanz. Thus, it's quite a difficult situation to decide on that. That would likely take a considerably longer time and could potentially even necessitate the deployment of specific specialized ground forces. It's not about a massive, large-scale ground offensive, but rather special forces who could, for instance, provide crucial intelligence on whether these critical facilities have been successfully neutralized. According to reports from American sources, one of the crucial objectives would be to decisively and sustainably prevent Iran from achieving nuclear armament, effectively ensuring this for the entire foreseeable future. Of course, it's another thing entirely if the objective is to bring about a regime change. That is, from my point of view, it would only be possible if there were a significant and well-structured opposition group within Iran itself. This group would then, from Iran's perspective, rise up and attempt to take control when the military or paramilitary capabilities of the country are on the verge of collapsing to zero, to install their own government, to establish their own state leadership. From the outside, that could also definitely be supported with the explicit goal of preventing any retaliatory measures from the current regime or whatever might be left of it after such actions. As long as this opposition group in this structured form doesn't exist, and I don't currently see it, an overthrow, a regime change will be extremely difficult to accomplish unless one wants to deploy ground troops there. Deploying ground troops is a completely different endeavor, and even if, a bit boastfully now, excuse me, from my perspective, sources from the US are quoted as saying, yes, we don't rule out using ground troops. You simply have to phrase it that way, of course, to keep the enemy completely in the dark. There are always war games that simulate the deployment of ground troops, and these can sometimes become a real nightmare also because of Iran's difficult topographical conditions.
Afghanistan.
For instance, it is of course absolutely clear that following a comprehensive, more or less complete, a neutralization of Iran's military capabilities, specifically their armed forces and the Revolutionary Guards, an invasion involving a limited number of ground troops would certainly be quite conceivable. But that, as I said, necessitates the complete or at least extensive neutralization of the armed forces and the Revolutionary Guards. But there are currently no signs of that at all. So the relatively small marine infantry forces which might be stationed on one or another landing ship that's in the area, in the region, they are certainly not sufficient for such a task. Here we're speaking at best of small bridgeheads and commando operations in the most favorable situation, but certainly not a ground offensive aimed at supporting insurgent or reform-minded opposition members.
Do you think sending ground troops could even be approved domestically within America? We must always remember that Donald Trump ran as a peace president and is now a war president. The war is not very popular in the US when you talk to people. Over half are against it, especially his movement, which was completely against it. He's been constantly contradicting himself in recent years in what he says and what he does. What would be the worst-case scenario that could happen to the US?
Well, I envision two worst-case scenarios. One scenario is that in a situation where they genuinely believe Iran's armed forces and military capabilities have been completely neutralized, they might still proceed with smaller forces, such as the Marine Corps infantry, They would establish bridgeheads, endeavor to support the opposition, and under certain circumstances this could potentially result in end in a complete bloodbath because there were certain forces within Iran that were specifically held back to protect the regime directly, so to speak, and these forces would still be entirely intact. That would be, of course, that would be speculation. It is speculative to say so, but that would definitely be a worst-case scenario. Another worst-case scenario would be if, after a prolonged war, where Iran still finds itself capable of resistance, meaning that current military operations are not as successful as they were intended to be, a decision might then be made under certain circumstances to launch a ground operation to begin and meticulously plan and prepare for such extensive ground offensives here. I don't believe Donald Trump can afford that, politically speaking. From my perspective, he'd face a crushing defeat in the midterms because, as you mentioned, the war is far from popular in the US. What's more, this particular conduct of warfare already directly contradicts Donald Trump's image as a president of peace, wouldn't you agree? Well, I believe that would prove exceedingly detrimental for MAGA and its entire movement, which is already quite fractured on this matter and doesn't stand solidly behind Donald Trump alone.
What role would you currently attribute to China and Russia in all of this? Are they playing a substantial role in this situation? Could there still be massive disruptions of a more significant nature as a consequence? But China has hardly made a statement. Russia's president only commented, rather interestingly, that killing Khamenei would be considered quite cynical. What role is Russia playing? Is there anything diplomatic to expect, or is that irrelevant?
To address China first, of course, China is fundamentally interested in seeing this regime stay in power in Iran for its own strategic reasons, simply to keep the United States' attention further engaged in that region. Any area that keeps the US engaged and busy, of course, suits China just fine. This is because it diverts and ties up forces that might otherwise be deployed in the Western Pacific, forces that would be crucial if China were to decide on a more aggressive stance in that region. However, China is not willing to take aggressive military actions on behalf of Iran, nor to implement genuinely disruptive measures that would significantly impede such an operation and the American strategy. China isn't doing that. China is, of course, very active, both verbally and behind the scenes, working hard to minimize the damages. However, China is realistic enough, of course, to understand that Iran has no real chance, especially given its current isolated situation. And regarding Russia, it's quite clear. While there isn't a formal defense alliance between Iran and Russia, a strategic partnership certainly exists. This partnership, which is very much contractually agreed upon, has historically been utilized to provide each other with technology and weapon systems. And it is quite clear that Russia is absolutely incapable at this very moment of undertaking anything concrete in favor of Iran, because of course Russia's essential forces are tied up in Ukraine and are unable to be quickly moved, reoriented or whatever, without significantly weakening their own operations in Ukraine. Significantly weakening their own deployments in Ukraine, thereby naturally giving the Ukrainians the opportunity to very quickly regain lost territories under certain circumstances. Signs that things are looking up for the Ukrainians are especially apparent after the Starlink disruption for Russian forces. The Ukrainians are starting to recapture parts of their territory again, and from a Russian perspective that would accelerate and intensify significantly. This means Russia is simply unable to do that. However, what Russia certainly can do, and the question remains whether those channels are currently open, is to supply Iran with various weapon systems through its neighboring states, providing for both the Revolutionary Guard and its armed forces. But as I said, it's questionable whether those channels are even still open. The verbal communications, or rather the messages that Russia is now directing towards the West, have, from my personal perspective, reached a point where they can only be described as bizarre. This is because they are seemingly accusing the United States and Israel of engaging in actions that Russia itself, quite frankly, is actively employing in Ukraine. And that is now also before the eyes of the global public for Lavrov and Putin alike, something that isn't entirely unproblematic concerning their reliability and trustworthiness. Russia is steadily losing the trust of being a reliable strategic partner. This process began, of course, with its withdrawal from Syria and naturally also with partial withdrawals from North Africa. But most significantly, this loss of trust comes from losing its biggest, most crucial partner in the Western Hemisphere, namely Venezuela, and now, of course, with Iran as well. Russia, just like Iran, therefore continues to remain isolated. We have to be very clear about that. This is also a signal to the BRICS nations, which are always portrayed as so important, although they aren't really an alliance, that Russia is quite obviously no longer suitable as a leading power for BRICS. But conversely, of course, that also means that they will fall in line behind China, and that China's role will become increasingly important. Even if Iran, as a, let's say, loose ally of China, were to be lost, China actually becomes stronger and stronger due to Russia's weakness.
One more glance at Israel. Hezbollah in Lebanon also attempted to become active. Just how strong is Hezbollah still? And can the Israelis bring this under control relatively quickly, or is it still a truly relevant group that poses a tangible threat to the nation?
I believe, first off, the good news is this. Quite clearly, Hamas is no longer able to launch any dangerous actions against Israel whatsoever.
From Gaza.
That is the good news. From the Gaza Strip, absolutely nothing is coming at the moment, and probably nothing more will. So here, Israel obviously has the situation completely under control. Not quite so with Hezbollah in Lebanon. There are obviously still remnants here. Hezbollah has reconstituted itself after the Israeli operation, which not only decapitated Hezbollah and more or less successfully combated its leadership, but also completely destroyed significant portions of Hezbollah's weapon stockpiles. Of course, some remained, and with this, and with what was left, they have now been fighting Israel. However, if my understanding of this information is correct, then the most potent instruments, or rather the crucial systems that have significantly impacted Israel in recent days, have indeed come from the Iranian side, not from Hezbollah. Nevertheless, Israel is now also undertaking an operation that is more or less intended to secure and reinforce the Lebanese southern border, aiming to establish stronger defenses. Israel isn't actually marching into Lebanon, but apparently this action is deemed adequate to more or less secure its borders there, ensuring that settlements in northern Israel cannot be subjected to infantry attacks by Hezbollah from Lebanese territory, as such a threat appears to be a significant concern, unlike to being shelled with longer-range systems, because I believe Israel has that well under control.
Last question. We're already very short on time. What is your personal prognosis for the next few weeks, if one can even make prognoses? How do you believe this conflict will end?
I think that in the coming weeks we will continue to see similar operations from the air and from the sea, as is currently the case up to a point where the question will be, does the systematic Iranian resistance collapse or not? If that turns out to be the case, then new decisions will certainly need to be made. Potentially even, I believe there will now be considerable movement within Iran itself. The weaker the pressure exerted by the Revolutionary Guard and the various other instruments of the regime's oppression becomes, and one can certainly hope that this will be the case, the more likely it is that opposition groups could potentially begin to restructure themselves and gain strength once again. And depending on these very developments, further decisions will then be taken by Israel and the United States. I do believe Iran's nuclear program will still be significantly countered. But as I said, the armed forces, the military capabilities of the regime itself, primarily the Revolutionary Guard and the long-range assets, that must be dealt with first, and we will see that in the next, and neutralized, we will see that in the next few weeks.
Thanks so much for the chat, and I'm sure we'll speak again in the coming weeks.
Gladly, look forward to it.
Thanks.
Sure.
MENA Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.